Start with our first witness for the day.
Good morning, Your Honor, counsel, ladies and gentlemen. The state will call Dr. Jonathan Rich.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I affirm.
Right there. Thank you. And doctor, if you wouldn't mind, we'd appreciate it if you could take your mask off.
Thank you.
And I think the microphone should be in about the right place, but let's test it out by having you give us your full name, spelling each of your names.
My name is Jonathan Rich, Jonathan Rich.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Sure. AirPods? Thank you. Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rich, you're a medical doctor. You have to answer yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Would you tell us where you're currently employed?
Sure. I am a cardiologist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, Illinois, where I also am an associate professor of medicine at Northwestern University.
Dr. Rich, what have you come to talk to the jury about today?
I'm here as an expert cardiology specialist to provide my opinion as to how Mr. George Floyd died.
Have you ever testified in a court of law before?
This is my first time.
Would you briefly summarize for us your educational background?
Sure. So I attended the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign for my undergraduate studies, where I majored in biology and performed my pre-medical coursework.
Where did you go to medical school?
I went to the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York.
And do you know what a residency is?
Yes, I do know what a residency is.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what a residency is?
Sure. So after completing medical school, I went on to do training in internal medicine, and that training is referred to as a residency. I believe the term originated because you seem to spend all your time in the hospital. You were basically a resident there. And so that was a 3-year internal medicine residency.
And where did you do that residency?
I did that at the Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School.
Did you also have something called a fellowship?
Yes, I did.
What is a fellowship?
So upon completing internal medicine residency training, many will go on to practice at that point. I opted to specialize in cardiology. And so when you take on an additional specialty, that form of training is referred to as a fellowship.
And so did you do a fellowship?
Yes.
And where did you do your fellowship?
So I did my fellowship at the University of Chicago.
And were you what's known as a chief fellow?
Yes, I was the chief fellow.
What is a chief fellow?
So every fellowship program has about, on average, 18 cardiology fellows, 6 in each class. And so I was bestowed the honor to be the chief fellow, which is basically being the captain of the group.
Did you have any additional training then after your fellowship?
Yes, I did.
What was that?
So after completing cardiology fellowship, I decided that I wanted to sub-specialize further in a field of advanced heart disease that focuses on heart failure and heart transplantation.
Are you board certified?
Yes, I am board certified in both cardiovascular diseases and in advanced heart failure and transplant medicine.
Transplant cardiology?
That's correct.
What is transplant cardiology as a field?
So, thankfully, most people are not going to need a heart transplant, but on occasion, patients' hearts will worsen over time and get to the point where they're tremendously weak and can't function on their own anymore. The medicine isn't working. And so the field of transplant cardiology is one in which we try to see if we can find a suitable match for that individual to get them a heart transplant, essentially to restore their life.
Are you trained in basic and advanced cardiac life support?
Yes, I am, and I renew that training every 2 years as part of my job.
Let's talk a bit about your employment background. After you finished your fellowship, where did you go to work?
Right. So after completing the heart failure and transplant fellowship, I took my first position at the University of Chicago as a cardiovascular specialist in heart failure.
And were you employed there until May of 2013?
That is correct.
And where did you go to work after that?
So since May of 2013, I have been at Northwestern University, as I mentioned earlier, as one of the heart failure and transplant cardiologists.
Do you hold any leadership positions at Northwestern?
Yes, I do.
What's that?
So one of them is I am the medical director of the Mechanical Circulatory Support Program.
Mechanical Circulatory Support Program.
Right.
Now, what is that?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. But basically, we talked about heart transplant for a minute, so patients whose hearts become very weak and perhaps they're not a good suitable match for a transplant, or they just don't have time to wait for a transplant, we can implant mechanical heart pumps that, combined with their weakened heart, can restore blood flow to their body to improve their quality of life and allow them to live longer.
Do you have any other relevant leadership positions at Northwestern?
Yes, I do. I'm also the program director of the Advanced Heart Failure and Transplant Fellowship Training Program.
And what does your job then at Northwestern entail as relates to either heart disease, treatment, prevention?
Sure. So I could answer that by basically putting it into three major domains. As a cardiologist, I perform a lot of clinical work. That is probably the most intensive part of my job.
Before you go on, would you tell the jury what's meant by clinical work as compared to what?
Absolutely. Clinical work basically means patient care. Okay, so it's the actual acts of taking care of patients, whether it be in the hospital, outside the hospital. That's what we kind of think of when we say clinical. I also do a fair amount of education and teaching. I teach the students, residents, and fellows. I travel across the country and deliver lectures on a variety of cardiovascular topics and help chair medical meetings. And then the third part of my job as a cardiologist is I conduct clinical research and have been doing so in a variety of cardiovascular diseases for nearly 20 years.
Do you spend most of your time, though, providing clinical care to patients?
Yes, that is for sure the most intense aspect of my job.
And what does your clinical practice then entail in terms of taking care of patients?
Sure. So my clinical practice has three components. Number one is my job in the hospital. So I spend several months, sometimes 4 to 5 months of the year, as the lead cardiologist, rounding in the hospital, taking care of basically the sickest heart disease patients in the hospital, and I also oversee their care in the intensive care unit. The second part of my clinical duties is I see patients in the outpatient setting, in the office, in the clinic, where I evaluate, diagnose, and treat patients. Close to 50% of the patients, the new ones that I see in the clinic, are referred by other cardiologists because these patients can sometimes have pretty complex medical conditions. And then the third part of my clinical work is I perform procedures in a procedural suite we call the cath lab, where I measure pressures inside the heart and inside the lungs. And sometimes I will also take small biopsy samples of the inner lining of the heart for diagnostic purposes.
Given that you deal with a number of patients who could be really sick, do you ever have patients that will pass away?
So I work with a tremendous team at Northwestern, and my colleagues save countless lives, but unfortunately, many patients do die.
Do you ever have any involvement in determining the cause of death?
Oh, yes, I do.
Could you explain?
Sure. One of the most important parts of my job, in fact, is to determine what's wrong with the patient, including if they do actually die, how did they die? And so there are a number of ways in which I participate in that role of figuring out what happened to a patient, how did they die?
Are you involved in any hospital committees that have as their purposes determining the cause of why people die or pass away?
Sure, I do. So outside of being in the trenches, taking care of the patients at the bedside and figuring out what's going on and trying to discern what might have happened, I also participate on a committee that meets regularly. And what we do is we review all of the cases in the cardiac intensive care unit. We look at any near deaths and any deaths, and we review looking at the medical chart and all of the evidence to try to figure out what might have happened for quality purposes, to figure out if there was something else we could have done, and also to improve just our overall knowledge of the field.
Do you have experience with patients who sometimes pass away during what's called clinical trials?
Yes, so I also participate in clinical trials where we try to determine if a certain medication or a certain device is worthy of being approved to help patients. In the course of clinical trials, sometimes there are deaths. And so in my role, I have sat on committees, and our purpose on that committee is to review any deaths that do occur, look at all of the evidence to figure out, number one, why did the death happen? And number two, and sometimes this is one of the more important parts, to distinguish, was it a cardiac cause or was it for a reason that is not related to the heart?
Well, bringing this further home to this case, do you have experience with cardiac patients who die from what we call low oxygen?
Oh, most certainly I do.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so because I am a cardiologist who takes care of patients in the intensive care unit, having low oxygen levels is not uncommon. A lot of different disease processes can cause it, and low oxygen levels can be very detrimental. Some of our patients require ventilators and respirators, and so in the course of caring for these patients, sometimes they succumb to their illness because their body is not able to get enough oxygen.
Do you ever have to determine cause of death in the heart transplant context?
Yes. So in the field of heart transplantation, what happens is when you get a phone call that somebody has died and they want to be an organ donor. So what I need to do is look at the case from afar, but try to look at all of the records as closely as possible to really sort out how that individual died, and if there's any issues related to their heart or other parts of their body, to make absolutely sure that that heart would be a good match for my patient who we're trying to help. And so that's another element where you have to be really meticulous as you go through. You don't want to miss anything here, right? I mean, the stakes are way too high.
We've heard from a couple of pathologists in the trial. Does your job require you to work with pathologists?
Oh, yes, it does.
In what way?
So I work with cardiac pathologists actually pretty closely, perhaps more so than other general cardiologists. I mentioned that I take biopsy specimens of the inner lining of the heart, and I send those specimens to the pathologist to review under the microscope. We participate in conferences that include reviewing autopsies. One of the things that I have learned over the years and I've been actually taught this by the cardiac pathologists, is that while a pathologist can look under the microscope and give us very important information, I work with a world-renowned cardiac pathologist who reminds me nearly every day, please tell me as much clinical information as you can. Put it in clinical context, because how I diagnose and interpret what I see under the microscope is very much influenced by the clinical story. And so we work very closely together, because my pathologist looks under the microscope and actually sees the tissue at that level, and I can provide all of the clinical information, the timelines, etc., so we can truly get it right.
Just a little bit more background, Dr. Rich. Have you published in the field of cardiology?
Yes, I have.
Can you generally characterize what kinds of publications and how many?
Sure. So to date, I've published more than 200 combined abstracts, original manuscripts, reviews, and book chapters. And the topics have been pretty wide-ranging in the field of cardiology, from coronary artery disease, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, congestive heart failure, and another disease actually called pulmonary hypertension.
And what is pulmonary hypertension?
Pulmonary hypertension is high pressures that are specific to the blood vessels in the lungs. All right, so when the blood flows from the heart to the lungs, if the pressure is high in those blood vessels, we refer to that as pulmonary hypertension.
Doctor, would you generally describe for the jurors what is cardiology as a science?
Sure. So cardiology is the study of the heart at the most basic level. It's the study of how the heart functions, what happens when the heart develops disease, pretty much everything heart-related and how it interacts with the rest of the body in order to sustain life.
How do you go about assessing a patient with a cardiology issue?
Sure. So when you assess any patient, with or without a cardiology issue, but in this context, a cardiology issue, you typically begin by meeting the individual in the office, taking a history, doing a detailed physical examination, reviewing all of the medical records and the charts, looking at past procedures and tests that they may have had, sometimes speaking to other colleagues who you are caring for that patient with together, and then sometimes ordering your own tests for evaluation and diagnostic purposes.
Are some of your patients referred then from other cardiologists?
Yes, so because of my specialty in advanced heart disease, close to half the patients who I'm seeing in the office as new patients have been referred to me by other cardiologists, typically in the community or in the region, and I will assist them in consultation to figure out what's going on and what we need to do to help that individual.
In the ICU, do you take care of patients who have problems beyond the heart?
Yes, so it's interesting. As a cardiologist, I think part of the important reasons why they require of us to do that internal medicine residency training is because no organs work in isolation. And so my patients who have heart disease who also require the intensive care unit, they will usually have issues with many other organs, their lungs, their kidneys, sometimes their brain, their liver. And so you really have to be adept and have a really good understanding of not just the heart, but all of the organs of the body and really how they interact.
Dr. Rich, let's talk about your role in this litigation. How did you come to be involved in this case?
I was contacted by the state of Minnesota, and I was asked as a cardiologist if I could review the facts of this case to help determine how Mr. George Floyd died.
Have you been compensated by the state for the bulk of the work you've done on this case?
No, up until my time here now at trial, I have not received compensation.
And why not?
Probably for a couple of reasons. Mostly, I felt that my job as a cardiologist could really help inform the facts of this case. Every year, I take on a number of professional activities without compensation. I actually think it's a duty of our field. And so in this case, I felt I can make a meaningful contribution to the medical field.
So for your the compensation for your time while you're here at trial, are you being compensated at $1,200 per day?
Yeah, it's $1,200 a day while I'm missing work back at home.
Right. So let's talk about then your opinion or opinions in this case. Before we do, could you tell us what work you did? What did you review before forming opinions in the case?
Sure. So I was provided with a lot of evidence to look through, but mostly I looked through the medical records, interviews, all the videos that were provided to me, and the autopsy report.
Did you review some journal articles as well?
Yeah, as I was formulating my opinion and creating my expert report, I also looked up journal articles and embedded them into my report for references.
Have you formed any opinions in this case to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I have.
Would you tell us your opinion or opinions?
Sure. In this case, Mr. George Floyd died from a cardiopulmonary arrest. It was caused by low oxygen levels, and those low oxygen levels were induced by the prone restraint and positional asphyxiation that he was subjected to.
Well, let's discuss your opinion, Dr. Rich, and let's start it with just a general discussion of the circulatory system in the heart. So I'd like to talk about the right side of the heart, left side of the heart, and also the alveoli. Would you start off and just tell the jury, just remind them, what are the alveoli?
Sure. So you might remember hearing about this, but the alveoli are those grape-like structures that are at the very bottoms of the lungs. The alveoli is where the actual gas exchange occurs, meaning that is where, when we take a breath in, oxygen gets across the lungs and into the bloodstream, and then the carbon dioxide that needs to leave the body crosses that same barrier into those alveoli. So when we take our deep breath out, that's how the carbon dioxide is removed. So it's the alveoli of the lungs that serve that purpose.
And again, what does the heart do in the body?
What does the heart do? Well, the heart is the major pump, of course, of the body. The best way to think of the heart, in my view, is to actually think of it as two pumps, sort of a right side and a left side. So if we start with the right side of the heart, after all that blood got pumped to the body and is coming back to the heart, blood is always returned to the right side of the heart. So this is now blood that presumably does not have much oxygen in it, and it needs to get more oxygen. So that right side of the heart, its job is singular. It is to pump blood to the lungs, to those alveoli. So the blood, when it heads towards the lungs, it can pick up that oxygen that it doesn't have right now, and it can deliver carbon dioxide and other acids and waste products to be expelled from the body. Once that blood from the right side of the heart has picked up the oxygen that it needed, it sends it to the left side of the heart. Now, the left side of the heart gets all the glory because it is what then pumps all of that oxygen and nutrient-rich blood to the entire body, meaning to the lungs, to the kidneys, to the brain, to our muscles, to deliver oxygen, because every organ, every tissue of the body needs oxygen in order to function. And then once that process occurs, it repeats back to the right side and so forth.
And what happens if the lungs can't deliver sufficient oxygen to the heart? That is, if there's a low oxygen situation.
Okay, well, the heart is only as good as the fuel that it's provided with. So when that right side of the heart sends blood to the lungs and says, okay, can I have some oxygen, please? If there is no oxygen there, or not enough oxygen there, there is nothing the heart can do to extract more from the lungs. So it has to take that deoxygenated blood, that blood that does not have enough oxygen, and pump it to the left side of the body. The left side of the body says, okay, this is what I have. This is what I'm going to pump now. And so what ends up happening is if the lungs don't give enough oxygen to the body, the heart then has to pump insufficiently oxygenated blood to the tissues of the body, and that's when problems occur.
Well, then returning to your opinion, cardiopulmonary arrest caused by low oxygen induced by positional asphyxia. What caused the low level of oxygen in the case of Mr. George Floyd?
Well, in his case, it was truly the prone restraint and positional restraints that led to his asphyxiation. In a nutshell, he was just simply unable, using all of his muscles of respiration, his chest wall, what we call accessory muscles of respiration, which are extra muscles that will be triggered in the event that you're having trouble breathing. He was trying to get in enough oxygen, and because he was unable to, because of the position that he was subjected to, as we just discussed, the heart thus didn't have enough oxygen either, which then means the entire body is deprived of oxygen.
So, low oxygen induced by positional asphyxia. Did you consider other possible causes for Mr. Floyd's death?
Sure. I tried, of course, to be as thorough as possible, but I focused mostly on two other potential causes. Number one is whether there could have been a primary heart contribution to George Floyd's death, and the second was whether a drug overdose could have caused his death.
So, doctor, would you tell the jury what is a primary heart event?
Sure. So, a lot of things can injure the heart. For example, if you do not take in enough oxygen, that will injure all the organs, including the heart. When I use the term a primary heart event, I mean something that originated from the heart itself. So, for example, a heart attack. All right, one of the arteries of the heart just suddenly got blocked completely, and a heart attack occurred. Or the heart just, without any explanation, nothing else secondary inducing it, went into a serious ventricular arrhythmia. Okay, so the bottom part of the heart, that part that we were talking about that needs to pump blood to the body, suddenly went into a chaotic rhythm all on its own. If any of those things happened, then I would consider that a primary heart issue, not being caused or secondary to something else.
So you considered whether or not Mr. Floyd might have passed away from a primary heart event or a drug overdose. Did you reach an opinion or conclusion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether either of those two causes explain Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell us your opinion?
Sure. After reviewing all of the facts and evidence of the case, I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
Thank you, Dr. Rich. Would you tell us what evidence or facts, documents, what did you look at to help you to reach that conclusion about primary heart event and or drug overdose?
Sure. The three aspects of the evidence that I spent the most time reviewing were Mr. George Floyd's medical records, the videos, the different angles from the day that he died on May 25th, 2020, and the autopsy report.
So the medical records, the videos, and then the autopsy report.
Yes.
Let's start with the medical records then of those three. Would you tell the jury what you were looking for in the medical records?
Sure. So you get the medical records. It's usually pretty thick, but you take it one page at a time. And at the outset, I was looking to see if he had been diagnosed with any medical conditions. That's sort of the first step. Kind of just what you do with a patient in the office, sort of what medical problems do you have? And so I was looking to see initially what diagnoses George Floyd may have previously been diagnosed with.
And what were your takeaways then from having looked at the medical records and done this assessment?
So at that level, I felt pretty confident that Mr. Floyd had three medical problems. Number one, he had hypertension, high blood pressure. Number two, it appeared to me that he may have suffered from anxiety. And three, it looked like he also struggled with substance abuse.
Other than those three conditions, did Mr. Floyd have any diagnosis of heart disease while he was still alive?
No, he did not.
So you said you looked at the medical records not only for diagnoses of pre-existing conditions, but also for evidence of medical encounters?
Correct.
And by that you mean hospital visits, clinics, etc.?
Emergency room visits, exactly.
What did you find in that regard?
So this is, in my opinion, was a really important part of the review as well, because every time Mr. Floyd had an encounter with a medical professional, I viewed that as an opportunity to see if there was any signs, symptoms whatsoever, even subtle, that could have indicated, for example, that he had anything going on with his heart. And so at the emergency room visits, he had one prolonged hospitalization. I really tried to take a look at everything. I looked at any opportunity I could to see if he ever complained of chest pain, which he did not, palpitations, which is a fluttering sensation of the heart. I reviewed all of the documented physical examinations of his heart to see if there were any abnormalities noted, and there were not. No murmurs, nothing found. I looked at all of his labs that get sent to see if there were any cardiac markers of injury, which he did not have. I reviewed his EKGs and his other tests. I tried to be as thorough as possible because I view what we do as a clinician in some ways as actually being a bit of a detective. And our job is to try to figure out what might be going on, even if it's not overtly stated so in the chart.
Would you tell the jury, by the way, what an EKG is?
Sure, of course. So an EKG is shorthand for an electrocardiogram. That's the test where you'll see people put these little sticky things on the chest. We call them electrodes. And what an EKG basically is an opportunity at the surface level of the chest, but the technology is so fascinating. It can give you a glimpse into the heart itself to see a whole host of things, including, is there any evidence of any heart injury happening now or previously? Any abnormal heart rhythms? A whole host of other information that we can get from the EKG at that snapshot in time. And then sometimes what we'll do is we'll repeat EKGs down the line so we can compare and contrast and see if anything had changed.
So you looked at all of this medical information on Mr. Floyd, including the EKG. Did you note any cardiac problems that related to Mr. Floyd?
I noted no cardiac problems in the medical records as far as Mr. Floyd's medical condition was concerned, including everything I mentioned, the EKG, even a time where they put him on a continuous cardiac telemetry monitor, which they'll do sometimes just to see beat to beat if anything's going on. I reviewed that as well.
Did you see any evidence of Mr. Floyd having had any abnormal heart rhythms?
His EKG showed absolutely no abnormal heart rhythms. That cardiac telemetry that I mentioned that he had on for a few days did have, on a rare occasion, something you would call a PVC, which is a very normal finding. I don't know if anyone's ever felt their carotid flutter for a second or something like that. It happens to all of us. But absolutely no ventricular arrhythmias for the duration of the time that he was on the monitor.
And PVC is not a kind of plastic pipe. You mean preventricular contraction?
Yeah, premature ventricular contraction. Sometimes people refer to it as a skipped beat. A really normal phenomenon. If you drink a little coffee or anything else, you're sleep deprived. It's pretty common for us to have those totally normal findings, something that none of you should be concerned about if you feel that from time to time.
So did you find any evidence that Mr. Floyd had any negative heart conditions?
There was absolutely no evidence to suggest that at all.
Dr. Rich, isn't high blood pressure an abnormal heart condition?
So thank you for that question, because I think that's an area of confusion sometimes. So high blood pressure in and of itself is not a heart condition. High blood pressure occurs for basically two reasons. Number one, high blood pressure originates in the blood vessels of our bodies. Oftentimes it's genetically determined why our blood pressure might start to go up over time. If you have a strong heart, you can also generate high blood pressures, and so those two in combination. So why? Well, so I'll pause there and can explain more.
Well, did Mr. Floyd have a strong heart?
So every indicator is that Mr. Floyd had actually an exceptionally strong heart, because he was able to generate pressures of upwards of 200 millimeters of mercury on some occasions. We talked a little earlier about my role as a heart transplant cardiologist. One of the problems with patients when they need a heart transplant is the exact opposite. Their hearts are so weak they can't generate a high blood pressure. Their top number might just be 80. The reason why high blood pressure, though, is important, and it is important to treat high blood pressure, is because over time, if high blood pressure goes untreated, 10, 20, 30 years, the impact of that high pressure on the heart can eventually start to become a bit of a problem. So the way I explain it to my patients who come into the office and I talk to them about treating their high blood pressure is I say, remember, the heart is a muscle. So if you go to the gym and you pick up a couple of dumbbells and you start to lift the weights, initially it feels fine. In fact, you probably get a little stronger. Your muscle will likely get even a little thicker, a little bigger, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. And initially, that might actually be a really good thing. But if I came back, 10 years later and said, how's it going? You'd say, man, this is getting pretty tough. And then the muscle can start to tire out. So we do want to treat high blood pressure. I can't emphasize that enough. High blood pressure should be treated, but high blood pressure in and of itself is not a heart condition.
So we've talked about your review of the medical records. You told us that you also looked at video footage in forming your opinions. Would you tell us what you were looking for in the video footage that you examined?
Sure. So my approach to the video initially was sort of similar to my approach of the medical records, meaning I wanted to just do some cursory inspection, observation, basic stuff. What did Mr. Floyd look like? Was Mr. Floyd talking? And if he was talking, was he talking clearly, coherently, answering questions appropriately? Did I notice any evidence of abnormal physical exams on the video? Actually, I was trying to look for as well. When Mr. Floyd was walking, did he appear like he was walking without difficulty, or was it looking like he was perhaps with low blood pressure and maybe gonna fall down? I was listening for any opportunity I could to hear. He might say, I'm having chest pain, or I'm having those palpitations or fluttering sensations. Basically doing what I do when I assess any person for a possible medical problem. I was looking for any and all of those possible subtle signs.
And so this is video footage from Mr. Floyd's encounter on May 25th of last year.
May 25th, that's correct.
We're focused on things that would give you any insights into his ability to breathe.
Yes, of course.
And the ability to expand what's referred to as his chest wall.
Yes.
Again, to refresh the recollection of the jury, what is the chest wall?
Yeah, so the chest wall, which I'm trying to sort of show you with my hands here, basically makes up the bones and the muscles of the entire rib cage. And it might have been explained previously to you, but the chest wall and the muscles and how they interact, along with the diaphragm muscle inside, are the key structures that determine if someone is able to take in enough air and able to get enough out. So if there is, for example, the lungs can be working okay, but if the chest wall is diseased, if the muscles associated with the chest wall aren't able to contract and move and do their job, enough oxygen can't get in that way either.
So doctor, in our COVID world, do you make clinical assessments of your patients in your work life by video?
Yes, actually, that is one of the transformations that we have needed to adapt to this past year. We are getting back to now seeing most of our patients in person, but during the course of this pandemic, to minimize exposures, we've set up a lot of these tele-video visits with patients. And what I came to appreciate is that while there's no substitute to actually putting your hands on a patient. That's still preferable, in my opinion, to really examine them closely. You can get a lot of information off of a video assessment, even physical examination, by looking at, I have them turn their neck to the side and I can see their neck veins, which is an indicator of pressures. I can see their legs to look if there's any indication of swelling, which might be congestive heart failure. Of course, I could just see the patient. I can see how they're breathing. I can hear how they're talking, if they seem breathless or short of breath. So we actually have found out that we can do a lot via video assessments.
Were you able to then see Mr. Floyd at the period of time after he was first approached by the police on May 25th, 2020?
Yes.
What were your observations about Mr. Floyd from that initial encounter with the police?
So from his initial encounter, remembering particularly when he was asked to get out of his car, he appeared fearful, but was speaking, I thought, clearly, answering questions appropriately. Didn't see any acute, what we would call acute distress. I saw no indicators at that time that he was suffering from low oxygen, for example, or from any active medical problem. And as I said, I was really trying to keep a close eye on some of the subtleties of his appearance and speech and so forth.
Were you able to observe at the point that he was being asked to get into the squad car?
Yes, I was.
What were your observations with respect to that period of time?
Yeah, so I watched him walk to the squad car, and then I was observing an interaction where they were asking him to get into the back seat of the car. I heard him talking about how he was claustrophobic. There were times when he was being, I'm not sure if it was pushed into the car or how it was, and it had even made indicators at that time that he couldn't breathe. But all of my observations at that point were still that up until the point that he was kind of getting pushed or pulled through the car and ultimately onto the pavement, up until that point, I also saw no evidence that there was anything active going on from a cardiac standpoint. And that was really important for me to conclude.
And what sort of active thing might you have been looking for related to the heart over that period of time?
Yeah, so for example, let's say that he was having an arrhythmia, an abnormal heart rhythm, especially if it was originating from the heart. Oftentimes what will happen is you'll have the heart rhythm that goes abnormal, and you'll go from being like totally fine, like hopefully we all are here today, to instantly dizzy or even passing out. I didn't see any indicators that that was happening. I didn't hear him complaining of dizziness or, again, fluttering of the chest. I couldn't see any swelling in his body. Again, I didn't want to take anything for granted that even from the initial encounter up until that point, what if something developed from point A to point B? And so again, up until that point, I saw no indicators of low blood pressure or anything else abnormal with the heart.
Then turning then to the restraint on the ground that you were referring to, what were your observations then as a cardiologist from your having viewed Mr. Floyd's restraint on the ground by Mr. Chauvin?
Sure. So my observations were that he was restrained in a life-threatening manner. Specifically, my observations was that he was on the ground in the prone position, handcuffed, hands behind the back, a knee on the back of his neck, a knee on the back of his upper torso or shoulder, hands pushing his handcuffed hands further up into his chest. I observed a knee compressing his, I thought it was his buttocks or upper thighs, and then at various points his lower limbs, his lower extremities being pinned down to the ground. So that my initial observation was, what is the position, first and foremost, that he is being subjected to?
And did you see at some point in you watching the video that Mr. Floyd went into cardiopulmonary arrest?
Eventually, yes, I did.
Do you know what Mr. Floyd's heart rhythm was when he was taken from the scene?
Well, so in the course of the restraint, I was looking to see if his deterioration occurred rapidly, like I was just talking about. For example, a primary cardiac event, the most common arrhythmia is what we call ventricular fibrillation, or VF for short, VFib. When that happens, the individual will look relatively okay, meaning they're alert, they're talking, and then they will immediately become unconscious. On the other hand, if the cause of the cardiopulmonary arrest was from something else, for example, low oxygen levels, you will typically see that deterioration happening much more gradually and slowly. So my observations were the second, that you could see, at least I could see, his speech starting to become less forceful, his muscle movements becoming weaker, until, of course, eventually his speech became absent, eventually his muscle movements were absent, and then as we later discovered by the heart rhythm, he was in a PEA, cardiopulmonary arrest.
So I'd like to talk with you about two concepts, the one being PEA, which is pulseless electrical activity, and the other one being a thing called a systole.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So first, Dr. Rich, would you tell us what pulseless electrical activity is?
Sure. So pulseless electrical activity, or for short PEA, is a chaotic heart rhythm that you can see on the EKG or on the cardiac monitor, but there is an absence of a pulse. And so it doesn't meet criteria for this asystole that I think we'll talk about in a minute, or for ventricular fibrillation. Ventricular fibrillation, if I'll just use my fingers, is basically the heart rhythm looking like this. Okay, it's this little subtle fluttering, but basically nothing else going on. Pulseless electrical activity, if you are a clinician, a doctor, or a nurse, or anyone for that matter, who's ever been trained in cardiac arrest, one of the things that will come to mind immediately is whenever you see a PEA arrest, you need to think about what's causing it, because nearly all PEA arrests are being caused by something relatively specific, and if you can identify what that is, it can be reversed.
And what is the most common cause of PEA?
So you might have heard of others talking about the H's and the T's. So one of those H's, the most common cause for a PEA, cardiopulmonary arrest, is hypoxia, not enough oxygen levels.
Low oxygen?
Low oxygen.
And what about asystole?
So asystole is the flat line. So, when any human dies, they will eventually go into asystole, where there will be absolutely no heart rhythm occurring, even this chaotic rhythm. That is what we, again, sometimes call that flat line. So VFib is this kind of thing. PEA can have a variety of chaotic-looking rhythms without a pulse, and asystole is the absolute absence of any cardiac electrical activity.
If Mr. Floyd is in a PEA state, or generally anyone, is PEA reversible?
So it is important to put it into context. So we see PEA cardiac arrests in the hospital all the time. Whenever you see a PEA cardiac arrest, you rush to it, of course, and you begin the protocol. And that protocol is the H's and the T's. And so you give oxygen if you don't think they have enough oxygen. I mean, that's the most critical thing to do. Depending on the other H's, for example, hypovolemia or hemorrhage. If you think they're bleeding out from a trauma, you would rush and give them blood. And we're doing these things, of course, simultaneously because time is of the essence. So we resuscitate patients with cardiopulmonary arrest from PEA not infrequently. Unfortunately, PEA can also be a devastating cardiac arrest, and despite all of our best abilities, sometimes it's not reversible.
Dr. Rich, did you see any evidence at all that George Floyd had had a heart attack?
No, none whatsoever.
What about this notion of something called a silent heart attack?
A silent heart attack. Well, so a silent heart attack, a silent heart attack is sometimes referred if it looks like someone might have had a heart attack, but there were no clinical signs to suggest it. It's a relatively uncommon finding. It tends to happen in patients who have diabetes, because when you have diabetes, one of the problems with diabetes is you lose some sensation in the nerve endings. And so typically when you're having a heart attack, you'll see people clutch their chest. Oh my God, I'm having chest pressure, chest pain. Sometimes diabetics won't have that, and it's possible that they can have a silent heart attack. But there was no evidence that Mr. Floyd had any type of heart attack, a silent heart attack or a non-silent heart attack.
And so you talked about this a little bit, about the notion of a cardiac arrhythmia, the fluttering of the heart. I think you referred to as either the VFs or the VTs, ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia.
Right.
Was there any evidence that he'd had either one of those?
No, there was no evidence that he had any of those.
When somebody is suffering from ventricular fibrillation or tachycardia, did you describe that as what we might refer to as a sudden death event?
Yes, so ventricular fibrillation can certainly cause sudden cardiac death. That absolutely could be described as that.
And again, in viewing Mr. Floyd and his encounter on the videos from May 25th, did Mr. Floyd die a sudden death?
Mr. Floyd died a gradual death. It would not be considered the classic sudden death from the standpoint of how you're putting into that context, meaning when people have that ventricular fibrillation, that VF arrest, they literally go from being fine one moment to completely out the next. I don't know what happened. I was sitting next to him and he keeled over and was on the ground, and then that could have been a VF arrest. So sometimes there's semantics in terms of this, but in the case of Mr. Floyd, yes, he did have a cardiopulmonary arrest, but no, he did not. There was no evidence of a sudden cardiac death from VFib or any other malignant heart arrhythmia.
Okay, so we've talked about your review of the medical records, and we've talked about your review of the video. The third thing you said you reviewed was the autopsy report and findings.
Yes.
What were you looking for with respect to the autopsy report and findings?
Sure. So we're talking about the autopsy report here towards the end. I actually looked at the autopsy report first. Then I went back to the medical records that we've already talked about in the videos, and then I went back to the autopsy again. So what I was looking for in the autopsy was, well, first of all, everything. When we get an autopsy, oftentimes you'll get it because you're looking, could there be something that we weren't aware of that could have happened? But in addition to looking at all the findings, my major focus, of course, as a cardiologist, was anything and everything related to the heart.
What did you find?
It's interesting. I think what was most important was not only what I found, but what I did not find. So what I found was that his heart architecturally looked normal. He had a description of coronary artery disease, which I found notable because, as I mentioned before, he hadn't carried a diagnosis of coronary artery disease. Now, I mentioned that I found it notable. I certainly didn't find it unusual. because unfortunately coronary artery disease is so common. I mean, statistically, not to scare anybody, many of us in this room likely have coronary artery disease. I looked at whether there was any evidence whatsoever that Mr. Floyd could have had a heart attack based on autopsy. So when I looked at those arteries around the heart, I not only looked to see how narrow they were and what the composition of that narrowing was, but also whether there were any platelets or clotting factors or anything else of that nature in the arteries, which is what would be there if there was a heart attack.
And then did you see evidence of the platelets you would expect to see if Mr. Floyd had had a heart attack?
No, there were no description of any of the platelets or clotting factors or anything that would block off an artery. None of the arteries were totally, the word we'll often use is occluded, totally blocked off, which is what happens in a heart attack.
Yeah, I want to ask you about some of your specific findings in this regard, but first, for the jury, would you just tell them whether you excluded coronary artery disease as a cause for Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I have excluded that with a high degree of medical certainty.
Now, you talked about looking for evidence of platelets from the autopsy report and that you would expect it to have seen those if he had died from a heart attack, and you didn't see them.
Right.
What else did you see?
Well, so what I also saw was I looked at the heart muscle itself. So not only did the heart muscle itself not show any evidence of any injury at all, which you would see, like what if you mentioned the silent heart attack. What about a few years ago somehow he had a mini heart attack? You would see evidence of that in the heart. You would see scar tissue, etc. So not only did I not see any evidence of a heart attack, the pathologist did a very good job, in my opinion, actually, of describing what's called the endocardium. The endocardium is the innermost lining of the heart, and that is the most susceptible part of the heart to cardiac injury. Even the smallest of heart attacks will always originate on that endocardium, the inner lining. And the endocardium was not only described as normal, it was described as smooth and glistening, a completely normal finding, no evidence at all of even small microscopic injury.
Were you able, by your looking at the autopsy report on the heart, to tell whether there's any evidence as to whether Mr. Floyd had ever had a heart attack, even going back into the past?
Yeah, no evidence whatsoever of a previous heart attack.
Doctor, what is ischemia?
So ischemia is a reduction in blood flow to any organ of the body. That could be the heart, it could be the kidney, that can lead to basically insufficient delivery of oxygen for a short period of time. And if ischemia continues to occur for long enough, that can sometimes cause some irritability in that organ. But it's important to distinguish ischemia from infarct. Infarct is actually what we mean when we say a heart attack. A heart attack. When a marathon runner goes on a run, their muscles will get temporarily ischemic. When we lift muscles in the gym, and they talk about feeling the burn, that means you are feeling ischemia. You're feeling lactic acid buildup, and that's what ischemia is.
Any evidence of ischemia?
Not in the autopsy, no.
Let's talk about the blood vessels, the arteries, and the plaque that was in the arteries. Were you able then to eliminate the occlusions, the blockage in the arteries, as a contributing cause to Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I'd like to clarify. I saw no occlusions, meaning I saw no complete blockages. There were narrowings. There were narrowings in more than one blood vessel. Importantly, the main coronary artery, it's called the left main coronary artery, there was no description of any narrowings or disease in the left main coronary artery.
Why is that significant?
Well, because that is the very first pathway that blood travels down to then branch off into multiple other arteries. And so left main disease, as we sometimes call it in cardiology, is among all of the vessels probably the highest risk blood vessel if it were to get blocked off.
So how would you characterize the nature of the then plaque within the artery? Was it soft? Was it fractured? How would you characterize it?
I would characterize it the way that the medical examiner characterized it. I'm not an expert at characterizing plaque at a microscopic detail, but what I did appreciate was the description of what seemed to be not only relatively conventional looking artery narrowings, plaque buildup that we all will eventually get in our arteries, but also in one of the arteries it was described that there was an element of calcium. And I only mention that because that also indicates that this coronary artery disease didn't just kind of develop right away. It was probably a slow, gradual buildup of the narrowings, and that actually is a very clinically relevant finding in the field of cardiology.
Doctor, did you make any assessments around the size of Mr. Floyd's heart?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell the jury about that?
Sure. So when looking at the size of his heart, not just the size, but the thickness of the heart, it was described as being mildly thick or mildly enlarged. Now, depending on which criteria you use, one criteria would agree with that it was mildly thick or enlarged. Others would suggest that it was in the normal range. I do believe that it was likely mildly thick and mildly enlarged. It is an expected finding in somebody that has high blood pressure. So even though there are some scoring systems that might say it wasn't even enlarged at all, in my view as a cardiologist, I do believe there was just the smallest element of increased heart thickness. And as I mentioned before, that's important because that's exactly what the heart is supposed to do when there's high blood pressure. That is a normal response. The muscle's getting stronger, it's allowing the heart to work and work well. Now, if that goes on for, like I said before, 20 years, we can have problems. But early on, having a mildly thickened heart is not only a normal finding in someone with high blood pressure, it may actually be beneficial in the short term.
Doctor, putting all this together, did you see any evidence at all that the primary cause of Mr. Floyd's death originated in his heart?
No, I did not.
Let's talk about a new subject. Whether or not Mr. Floyd suffered from a drug overdose and died from a drug overdose.
Okay.
That was something that you also considered as a cause.
Yes, sir.
Were you or are you familiar with Mr. Floyd's toxicology results?
Yes, I am.
What or which substances did you consider in evaluating Mr. Floyd's toxicology history?
When I looked at the toxicology reports, I focused mostly on the finding of fentanyl as well as the finding of methamphetamines.
What role, if any, do you feel that the fentanyl played in the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
As far as I can tell from reviewing all of the facts of the case, I see no evidence at all to suggest that a fentanyl overdose caused Mr. Floyd's death.
As cardiologist, do you occasionally have to care for patients who struggle with opioids or opioid addiction?
Absolutely.
So here you found that the fentanyl, in your opinion, played no role in Mr. Floyd's death. Would you tell us why it is you hold that opinion? How do you reach that conclusion?
Well, I think I would break it down to just two major reasonings. Number one, it appeared to me that Mr. Floyd, who was an acknowledged frequent chronic user of substances, particularly opiates, likely developed a high degree of tolerance. There's even one emergency room visit that I had reviewed where he came in and he told the emergency room team that he was tearful and says, I'm having trouble with substance abuse. I think he said I took 8 Percocets within 2 hours. He had no side effects from that at all. They observed him for a couple hours and they discharged him. And just so looking through it, looked like he had built up a high tolerance just in general to opiates. But the second, and just as important, maybe more important, was I didn't see any of the signs of an opiate overdose when I reviewed the videos.
And when you then are referring to the signs of an opiate overdose, would you tell the jurors or describe for them what are those signs and what didn't you see?
Sure. So in my experience in the intensive care unit, taking care of patients who come in with an opiate overdose, first of all, they are usually extremely lethargic, oftentimes nearly unarousable. And then you try to wake them up and they're falling right back asleep. They're not talking to you. If they are talking to you, they're often having slurred speech. If they're standing up, which they wouldn't be if they had a fentanyl intoxication and overdose, they would have to imagine get pretty dizzy pretty quickly. I kind of saw all the opposite with Mr. Floyd. I saw that he was alert, he was awake, he was conversant, he was walking, and yet, according to the toxicology report, he had this degree of fentanyl in his system. So just looking at the clinical story, I didn't see any signs or symptoms of fentanyl overdose.
Let's turn to methamphetamine then. What role do you feel that methamphetamine played in Mr. Floyd's cause of death?
I feel it played no substantive role at all.
And why is that?
Well, all considering, it was a very relatively low level of methamphetamine in his system. And so when you look at the context of the case and you see a relatively low level of methamphetamine in the context of everything else, I felt very confident that that low degree of methamphetamine was not what was triggering this profound cardiopulmonary arrest and ultimately PEA arrest.
So Dr. Rich, then, taking into account all of the evidence that you reviewed, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I do.
Would you tell us what that opinion is?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable.
Were there critical points in time during his subdual and restraint on the ground when you feel measures could have or should have been taken that would have preserved his life?
Yes, I do. I think there were several junctures, actually.
Would you tell us about those?
Sure. Well, the first, of course, was to not subject him to that initial prone restraint positioning that he was subjected to. I mean, that is first and foremost. So if that was not the case, I don't think he would have died. The second, though, was when he was in that subdual and restraint positioning, and he was stating repeatedly that he can't breathe, and he was getting a little weaker in his speech. There was one moment in the video where I heard one of the officers saying, I think he's passing out. That would have been an opportunity to quickly relieve him from that position of not getting enough oxygen, perhaps turn him into a recovery position and allow him to start to expand his lungs again and bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So in addition to not putting him in that position in the first place, when there were signs that he was worsening, repositioning him, I think very likely would have also saved his life.
Was there a point in time, Dr. Rich, when Mr. Floyd was checked for a pulse when he was in the subdual and the restraint of Mr. Chauvin?
Yes, there was.
At the time that he was checked for a pulse and he no longer had one, in your opinion as a cardiologist, was there anything Mr. Chauvin could have done at that point in time that would likely have saved Mr. Floyd's life? Well, at the time that Mr. Floyd is determined to have not had a pulse, what is your opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, as to what Mr. Chauvin may have done that would have potentially saved his life?
Overruled. You can give an opinion.
Well, just prior to that point, I heard one of the officers actually ask, actually on 2 occasions, if Mr. Floyd should be turned on to his side. And the response was, no, just leave him. And once the officer announced that he did not have a pulse anymore, I think he actually said he does not have one, was the exact words. At that point, the immediate response would then be to not only relieve him of the restraint, but at that point now you've got to start CPR. You've got to start immediate chest compressions, because we know that if you can get to a patient right away, even when they've lost their pulse, even when they've gone into a cardiopulmonary arrest, there is a significant opportunity to save a life. But for every minute that transpires that you are not performing the basic life support and CPR measures, the literature would suggest an approximately 10 to 15% less chance of survival. It is why we pour so many resources these days into community education and training for bystander CPR, because it's so effective and it works if the person can be tended to quickly enough.
Then from your review of the video, where you could see Mr. Floyd and Mr. Chauvin there on the ground, if Mr. Chauvin knew CPR, did you see any reason from your observation that he could not have supplied CPR?
Not within the opinion, medical opinion, so that is sustained.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Sustained.
All right.
It's not a medical opinion, counsel.
So at the time then that Mr. Floyd was actually put into the ambulance from the scene, in your opinion as a cardiologist, what would have been the prospects of resuscitating him at that point?
Overruled. You may give an opinion if you have one.
So at that point, I think the chance of meaningful survival, unfortunately, was very low, because I counted the number of minutes that he was on the ground, pulseless, without any CPR. And by the time the paramedics rushed in to get him and to get him onto the stretcher and into the back of the ambulance, at that point, a lot of time had passed. I give tremendous credit to the efforts of the paramedics and the doctors and nurses in the emergency room. I mean, they worked on him for what seemed...
Sustained. This is non-responsive.
Dr. Rich, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd would have lived if not for the 9 minutes and 29 seconds of subdual and restraint?
Objection.
Overruled if you have an opinion.
Let me finish my question for you, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether George Floyd would have lived if not for Mr. Chauvin's subdual and restraint of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds on the ground?
Yeah.
Overruled. A reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Yes, I believe he would have lived.
Last question, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether a completely healthy George Floyd, that is, any healthy human being, would have survived the subdual and restraint that Mr. Floyd suffered during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of 2020?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
It's sustained as irrelevant as to a general person.
I'm sorry, Your Honor, I couldn't hear you.
Sustained.
My question for you, Dr. Rich, is would any person a healthy person, have survived the circumstances or conditions that George Floyd underwent during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of last year?
Same objection.
Sustained.
No further questions, Dr. Rich.
Members of the jury, let's take our 20-minute mid-morning recess. Let's come back at 11:25. Thank you. Just a reminder, doctor, you're still under oath.
Good morning, doctor.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here with us today. Just a few questions for you. Shouldn't take too long. Just to confirm, you're not a pathologist yourself, correct?
I'm a cardiologist.
The vast majority of the patients that you treat are in a clinical setting, correct?
Correct.
Meaning they're alive generally when they see you?
Yeah.
All right. Can we agree that it is a pretty common occurrence that people die who have arteries that are 90% blocked?
No, sir. Well, everyone dies eventually, but not from the 90% blockage.
People die every day who have a 90% blockage.
People die every day from heart attacks.
Well, there's a difference between a heart attack and heart failure, right?
Heart attack and heart failure, you are correct, are completely different terms.
Okay. So people who have a 90% blockage may have a cardiac event and may die.
As a hypothetical,
Yes.
hypothetically, there are undoubtedly people who have died from coronary events with 90% blockages or without blockages.
Okay. And people may not experience pain, right, as a result of an arrhythmia?
Correct.
And sometimes people have a 90% blockage of the right coronary artery and a 75% blockage of the left anterior descending artery, and they die, right?
Again, this is a not this case we're talking about.
Exactly. Hypothetically.
In a hypothetical case, somebody who has any extent of coronary disease, including the descriptions that you just gave, could potentially die. Sure.
And again, they may have no pain associated with a fatal arrhythmia, right?
Fatal arrhythmias often are not associated with pain, in fact.
You would agree that Mr. Floyd did have coronary artery disease.
Absolutely.
And how is that normally, in a living person, how is that normally diagnosed?
So usually the patient has symptoms. So they will have chest pain or they're exercising, right? If you're an active person, you shouldn't have chest pain. And if you come to the doctor and say, something's not right, every time I try to exert myself or boy, it feels like the elephant on the chest is the classic description. So that would be one of many possible ways that you would diagnose coronary artery disease in someone who is alive.
May also do a stress test.
Sometimes.
A blocked right coronary artery that can contribute to a fatal arrhythmia.
Anyone can have a fatal arrhythmia with or without coronary artery disease.
And so if a blood vessel is blocked and blood is not getting through that vessel, what happens?
Well, it depends, but I'd like to answer that for you. So in the case of Mr. Floyd, what has most likely happened, based on our understanding of coronary physiology, is precisely because he had a narrowing of up to 90% and it had calcium in it. We know that that developed gradually. And the heart is fascinating in what it does. It develops what's called coronary collaterals, which means the body makes additional blood vessels so that if there's one artery that's narrow, it recruits and builds many more blood vessels to supply blood to the heart. It's actually why you are more likely to die from a heart attack if you started with a lesser narrowed artery and the plaque ruptured and blocked the vessel than if you started with a more severe narrowing because of all these unbelievable coronary collaterals and adaptive responses that the heart does when that happens.
What is a safe dose of methamphetamine?
Prescribed?
Illicit.
I would never consider any illicit drug to be off the street that's not prescribed by a physician to be safe.
And methamphetamine is a vasoconstrictor, correct?
It often can act as a vasoconstrictor.
That means it constricts the blood vessels more, correct?
Yeah, correct. That's what vasoconstriction means. Narrows them down more.
You understand, based on the medical records, that there's prior evidence of methamphetamine use by Mr. Floyd?
Yes, sir.
And methamphetamine can cause some changes to the heart in and of itself, correct?
Correct.
In fact, it sort of ages the heart more, right?
I've never used that terminology.
Okay. What does it do to the heart over prolonged use?
Every case is different, and it depends what we mean by prolonged use. So 1 day, 1 week, 25 years. Like most things, if you smoke cigarettes for 50 years, you're going to have more problems than if you smoked a cigarette or a pack every once in a while.
In terms of what does methamphetamine do to the heart itself?
So methamphetamine, if used over a long period of time, can sometimes contribute to the development of coronary artery disease, as we've been discussing. It can constrict blood vessels, as you mentioned. It can have kind of a host of different effects on various parts of the body, including the heart.
And there's lots of things that can make the heart work harder and faster, right?
Sure.
I mean, methamphetamine being one of them.
Yes.
Vigorous activity being one of them.
Sure.
Adrenaline.
Yeah, I mean, we all right now have a lot of adrenaline flowing through our system. Adrenaline is needed for life, for sure.
Increases in adrenaline can cause the heart to work harder and faster.
Yeah, I mean, so adrenaline, which is the lay term for catecholamines, that's the purpose of adrenaline, is to get it to pump more blood. When we go and exercise, the purpose of adrenaline is so we can run and we can jump, and we ask the heart to allow us to do that, correct?
And have you, in your practice, worked with someone who has a paraganglioma?
I have had a couple of patients who've had what we call pheochromocytomas, which is a type of paraganglioma, yes.
In the hip area generally?
No, generally it's actually near the adrenal gland, which is sort of just near the kidneys. But these paragangliomas can sometimes pop up in different places.
And how are they typically identified?
Well, so it depends. If it was clinically pertinent, that's how I diagnosed the ones that I've had. The classic findings are the person who's saying, I'm always having headaches. What is with these headaches? I'm always sweating. Why am I always sweating? And you start to say, I wonder if something is releasing a hormone that can be contributing to that. Other times, like in my opinion, the case here with Mr. Floyd, you'll pick them up incidentally, say at an autopsy.
They're also often identified because it contributes to high blood pressure.
It can, that is right.
You have agreed that you've reviewed the medical records of Mr. Floyd, correct?
Correct.
And he has a pretty significant history of extremely elevated blood pressures, right?
Yes.
I think the one you referenced, that the top number was over 200.
Yeah, on more than one occasion.
On more than one occasion. And the lower number of the blood pressure was likewise elevated, right?
Yes.
Did you observe evidence that in the medical records that Mr. Floyd was taking prescribed medications to control his blood pressure?
I saw in the records during an emergency room visit that he was prescribed high blood pressure medication. What I could not see is whether he was taking them or not, but it did look like at one point there was a prescription given to him. I think one of them was for amlodipine, which is a calcium channel blocker, and one of them was for, I I think either hydrochlorothiazide or chlorthalidone.
And you'd agree that the records that you had for Mr. Floyd were relatively limited, agreed? I mean, they weren't his entire life medical records.
I don't know when he started to see medical professionals. So for all I know, the first instance in the records that I saw was the first time he started to see medical professionals. I'm not sure.
So how many years of past medical records did you review?
I believe 3 or so. I think the beginning of 2018 is when I think they started.
Are paragangliomas ever removed from a person?
Paragangliomas, if they are causing those symptoms that I mentioned, the pulsatile headaches, the sweating, etc., a surgeon would sometimes remove them.
Would you prescribe an amphetamine for somebody who has a 90% blockage of the right coronary artery and a 75% blockage of the left anterior descending artery?
So first of all, I don't typically prescribe amphetamines. I have many patients who have coronary artery disease that are on stimulants, okay, for a variety of medical conditions. So I just don't prescribe them, but I do have many patients with coronary disease who are on stimulants.
Would you recommend to someone that they use methamphetamines with that degree of coronary artery disease?
I would never recommend that anybody take methamphetamine off the street for any reason.
Are you aware of the research showing that deaths where both methamphetamine and fentanyl are found, it occurs at a much higher incidence?
Can you repeat that question, please?
Sure. Are you aware that the research has demonstrated that deaths of those who use methamphetamine and fentanyl have been notably higher than meth or fentanyl alone? The combination.
Objection, Your Honor, for lack of foundation, assuming facts.
As to assuming facts, that is overruled. Is it the scope of his foundation? Since the state did ask him for toxicology opinions.
Sure, but the reference to medical articles, none of which anyone has seen, is simply counsel's reference, Your Honor.
Overruled. You may answer if you know.
Okay. I am not familiar with the breadth of the literature looking at all of the different combination of drugs and which combination worsens or improves survival.
You testified that Mr. Floyd, based on your review of the video, did start complaining of shortness of breath prior to being placed in the prone position, right?
Yes, I heard on more than one occasion he say the words, "I can't breathe."
And if Mr. Floyd had simply gotten in the back seat of the squad car, do you think that he would have survived?
Objection, Your Honor. It's not called for medical testimony.
You may give it if you have a medical opinion as to that. Overruled to that extent.
So, had he not been restrained in the way in which he was, I think he would have survived that day. I think he would have gone home or wherever he was going to go had he not been subjected to the prone and positional restraint that he was.
So in other words, if he had gotten in the squad car, he'd be alive.
I think my answer remains the same. Anything other than that scenario that he was subjected to, I have no reason to think from a medical perspective that he would not have survived that day, correct?
And in terms of the prone position, you would agree that the prone position is not in and of itself inherently dangerous?
In an ordinary individual, if we were to take away everything else that was going on and someone was just simply lying in the prone position, while there are many patients who that would be inherently dangerous, the average individual, I would agree with you, probably just lying flat in that situation generally wouldn't be dangerous.
Even in the ICU, there are circumstances where people have serious medical conditions where they're maintained in the prone position. Agreed?
In the ICU, when patients are put into the prone position, it is when it is a desperate attempt to save someone's life where their lungs have actually developed what we call acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. They have a ventilator in to make sure that the amount of air that they get, no matter their positioning, will always be enough. And so it's a funny thing to think about putting someone in the prone positioning in the ICU on a respirator, but because of respiratory physiology, sometimes that will actually help open up certain segments of the lungs that are needed for oxygenation. But it's really important to keep in mind that they are on a respirator every single time to open up those lung airways, and they're usually on sedation as well to keep them comfortable.
And my last question, doctor, is after someone's heart stops, is it possible that they continue to respire?
It is, well, I'm not sure I could answer that with certainty other than to say there are these things that are called agonal breaths. So when I'm in the intensive care unit with a patient who is dying and they go into cardiac arrest, once in a while you will see them take 1 or 2 extra breaths. I'm not sure the exact mechanism or the physiologic trigger for that. So you could potentially see some extra breaths for a short period of time.
By a short period of time, up to a minute?
In my experience, if the heart has completely stopped, I would not expect to see the breathing continue for up to a minute, but I might expect it to be seen for several seconds.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
Dr. Rich, you were asked several questions that had to do, or at least had as a premise, the blockage of Mr. Floyd's arteries. Is blockage a proper medical term to you as a cardiologist to describe the narrowing in Mr. Floyd's arteries?
So when we try to use terminology that is not medical terminology, right, to explain these phenomena, the term blockage I tend to use when the blood vessel is completely blocked. There's a blockage. I will usually describe, if I have a patient like Mr. Floyd who has coronary artery disease like this, I will usually use the term narrowings because the blood is still getting through. In fact, the blood may be getting through just fine. There is no level of narrowing, in fact. Even a totally blocked artery, this is what's fascinating, that develops over time, the territory of blood that blood vessel was supposed to supply can still be getting enough blood because of those collateral vessels that develop. So I would use the term with Mr. Floyd as narrowings.
You were asked questions again about paragangliomas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you told us that those are usually preceded by headaches of some kind.
Classically correct.
One of the symptoms is headaches.
Yes, that is right.
Again, did you hear amongst the various complaints Mr. Floyd may have had about pain, did you hear any of them being a headache?
No. In fact, when I saw that there was a paraganglioma described as an incidental finding in the autopsy report, I actually, when I went to the medical records, I used that Control F button to put in headache and make sure that I never found headache, in addition to scrolling through all of the records. I didn't find headaches at any point.
When you referenced paraganglioma being an incidental finding on the autopsy, would you tell the jury what's meant by incidental?
Sure. So all of us have things in our bodies that aren't causing any medical problems. But if they're discovered, let's say someone gets a CAT scan for one reason, they might find that there's a cyst on the kidney or the liver. Sometimes we'll even pick up benign tumors. So we refer to those as incidental findings. In fact, in the case of paraganglioma, The name we would actually call it is an incidentaloma, because we don't think it has clinical relevance, but it was found and described in the imaging, or in this case, the autopsy.
Are you familiar with any of the data as to how many people in the United States have ever died as a paraganglioma as the principal primary reason for death?
To be honest, I don't know the exact numbers. I just know that they are very low.
Now, you were asked questions about high blood pressure, the role and impact of methamphetamine, paraganglioma, narrowing arteries. Can any of those things in of and by themselves cause someone to die without first injuring the heart?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, what I'm trying to get at, whether we talk about high blood pressure, methamphetamine, paraganglioma, and the impact on the adrenals, narrowing of the arteries, can any of those things by themselves cause a person to die without first impacting the stoppage of the heart?
Well, the reason I ask you to ask the question again is because I want to make sure that I'm precise and clear here. High blood pressure can cause death in manners outside of the heart. For example, it can contribute to a stroke, which we know Mr. Floyd didn't have. And the other thing that can occasionally happen is this thing called an aortic dissection, where the aorta, the main tube that leads the heart, can tear. That can cause death. So I want to make absolutely clear, these conditions can cause death on occasion in areas not involving the heart, but most of the time, if death is going to occur by them, it's going to be caused because of their impact on the heart.
And did Mr. Floyd have an aortic dissection?
No, he absolutely did not, based on the review of the autopsy.
He didn't have a stroke?
He also did not have a stroke.
So again, just to be clear for the jury, with all the discussion about the narrowing of arteries, meth, etc., was there any damage at all observed to Mr. Floyd's heart muscle?
Based on my review of all of the evidence, the EKGs, the autopsy report, I found absolutely no evidence at all of heart damage in Mr. Floyd's heart.
Thank you, Dr. Rich.
Any recross?
Just one question.
On redirect, you were asked a question about the paraganglioma, the coronary heart disease, high blood pressure, if any one of those can cause death independently, and you answered relevant to the high blood pressure, right? But you would agree that when you combine a lot of you would agree that the body is, a lot of things are happening at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And in combination, if you have a paraganglioma, you've got an increase in the fight or flight kind of response. You've got coronary heart disease. You've got high blood pressure. All of those things combined could cause death, even if there was not a physical restraint.
Well, there's his paraganglioma. The likelihood that his paraganglioma was even releasing any hormone is highly unlikely.
But in terms of the combination, the drugs, the high blood pressure, take the paraganglioma out of it, right? The increase in adrenaline from a struggle with officers. All of those things combined together, even in the absence of prone restraint, could have resulted in death. Yes or no, sir?
Upon my review of the evidence and the facts of the case, I found no evidence to support that.
Fair enough. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
You are excused.
Thank you.
And we have our next witnesses at 1:30, is that correct? All right, we have two witnesses for this afternoon, members of the jury, and counsel and I have to finish up some legal issues at 1, so we're going to break until 1:30. Have a good lunch.